Good evening, everyone. Thank you again for joining us this evening and for timely being here. And I apologize if you had to wait a couple of minutes. My name is Sharon Shafrir. I see that my name is not appearing at the bottom of the screen, so I'll fix that in a minute. My name is Sharon Shafrir. I'm the co-founder of Hope for Israel Alliance. We are a nonprofit grassroots movement that has been advocating for the past over a year for the release of the hostages, for democracy in Israel, and for the important things that the Jewish communities in the diaspora are concerned with, specifically addressing anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic expressions in various organizations and in the local communities, etc. Tonight, I'm co-hosting this event with my colleague and friend Lee Steinberg, another Hope for Israel Alliance activist from Las Vegas. Lee, would you like to say a few words?
I'm very excited to be here, even though it's a tough conversation, but I think most conversations we've been having the past year and a half have been tough. Just excited to be here, and we'll share more in a few minutes after Sharon gives some house rules.
Yeah, so just I did write a few things in the chat. Please notice if you are not feeling that you are engaged completely in the conversation, just turn off the camera in respect of our guest, Bonnie Abrams, and in respect of the topic. Other than that, we're very happy to have you all, and we're looking forward to our guest's presentation. So, Lee, why don't you introduce our guest tonight?
All right, so we're very excited to have with us Bonnie Abrams. She's the child of two Holocaust survivors. She created a program called Voice of the Second Generation. She's very active in talking about the Holocaust, talking about the memories, about the effects, and also sings and will share some of that with us. She's presenting this program to students and community groups. And she's been the director of the Center for Holocaust Awareness and Information, CHAI, of the Jewish Federation of Greater Rochester from 2007 till 2019. Her mother's story is actually featured in a theater show called Survivors. And I just found out today that this is the case with Bonnie, and my daughter is actually on the cast of this show in California for the past 2 years. So this is a very small world, and I'm very excited to hear Bonnie's story. So Bonnie, here's to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sharon and Lee, and Hope for Israel Alliance for inviting me to speak tonight. So there's been chapters added to, psychology textbooks about children of survivors and all of the various psychological problems that we're supposed to have. And, I probably have some of them, but I think that I have done a little better than some of the other children of survivors because my parents were always open with me. They always talked to me about their experiences. And, we didn't know back in the olden days, we didn't know from intergenerational trauma, and we now know about that. But the way this kind of happened for me is I've always been a singer-songwriter, so I would write songs about whatever, was meaningful to me. So, so I grew up in New York City in the 1960s. That happened to be a time which was, I think, rather a-religious. Religion was just not in the forefront at that time. There were many other new things. So, my parents, we didn't go to temple. My main connection with being Jewish was knowing that my parents survived the Holocaust. So Anyway, I'm living an hour from Rochester in a rural area. I'm working as a winemaker. And because I like to sing, I joined a choral group. I was the only Jewish person in the choral group. And the director said, Bonnie, you're Jewish. Do you know anybody up at Temple Beth El in Rochester? I said, no. You're Jewish, don't you know anybody? And I didn't because I didn't go to Temple. Well, we were doing the piece Judah Maccabeus, a Handel piece, which basically tells the Hanukkah story. So he wanted to perform it in a synagogue. So therefore, Bonnie, the Jewish person, cold calls Temple Beth El. And I'm really not sure what to say to this person who runs adult ed. And I start to say, oh, I should check your synagogue out sometime. I'm a child of Holocaust survivors, and we never went. And before I finished my sentence, she said, really? You're the child of Holocaust survivors? I'm the director of the Holocaust Resource Center here in Rochester. And I said, oh, you are? I've written some songs about being a child of survivors. You have? I have a student conference in April. Would you like to do your song? So sight unseen, I was asked to present some of these songs. So I put it together with my parents' stories because I was fortunate that always age appropriately, they told me, their stories. And I would get these very nice letters from Barbara Applebaum saying the second generation has found its voice, and I hope someday when I retire, you will consider taking this position. And I felt, well, she's probably just being polite because my background is in science. I was a biologist and a chemist. I'm not exactly, wasn't an educator. But sure enough, as I said, I was working as a winemaker. And she said, I'm retiring now, Bonnie, apply for the job. And I didn't know what to do, but I said, I guess I'll apply for it. And I said, I don't have to worry, they'll hire an educator, but when they hired me. So it then became my job, and a very important part of my job, to bring Holocaust survivors in the Rochester area to speak at schools and community groups. And at this point, my father had already died. My mother was living in Florida. And she would often visit me for Passover. And of course, as everyone knows, Yom Hashoah is right after Passover. So she would come with me to programs that I was doing. So one year early in my tenure, I was asked by a librarian to lead a book discussion on the book I Have Lived 1,000 Years by Livia Bitten Jackson. And it's a well-written autobiography. And I figured it's great, I'll bring my mom along. I expected me and like 8 ladies sitting around a table. The librarian calls me the night before, frantic. She says, I just got a call from a teacher in the middle school. She wants to bring 65 8th graders to this book discussion. And I wasn't worried because my mother was there, and I figured she had some experiences that were similar to Livia Bitten Jackson. And if the kids start to get antsy, I'll just call on her and ask her to speak. So sure enough, after one comment was made, I said to my mom, you had a really similar experience. Would you mind telling your experience? So she starts talking, and about 5 or 6 minutes later, the lights go out. And I thought, oh, the power's out. The librarian gets up and starts doing this. They were motion sensitive lights, and 65 8th graders had not moved enough to keep the lights on. And that's when I knew I needed to bring my mom up to Rochester to be one of my speakers. And it was a great pleasure of mine to be able to bring my mom to speak and present with her. I put together a PowerPoint, which I'm going to show you. And she would tell her story. And every once in a while, when you're telling a story, like I'll probably do the same thing tonight, she'd forget something that I thought was an important point. I'll say, Mom, tell the tomato story, and then it was nice that we could do this together. So I'm really glad that I was able to do that with her for the last 8 years of her life. And so that being said, I'm going to start the PowerPoint. At least I'm going to hope to start the PowerPoint. Oh, it worked. Beautiful. Everyone can see that?
No, you have to
Well, I
share.
didn't hit share. I was all excited because I didn't hit. All right, let me escape. I knew that was too easy. Share. Okay. Now,
No,
there it goes.
let's see.
Okay.
Okay.
All
Nice.
right, now I can start the slideshow. That's better. Now we're okay. Anyway, I really didn't want the technology to screw up, so it wasn't too bad. So this was a poster that was created when my mother spoke in Corning, New York. And so this is an actual picture that was taken in Germany of a lot of what was my remaining family. And so they colorized my mother, and this was my brother who was born in Germany, and my dad. This is my dad's oldest sister. My parents were both the babies of their family, and my dad was 8 years older than my mother. So his oldest sister was 11 years older than he was. So her daughter was the same age as my mother. And I always used to call her my aunt, and she'd say, "I'm not your aunt, I'm your cousin." Because, when you're a little kid, a grown-up is an aunt. And then when I understood more, I realized, wow, she's the only grandchild that was born before the war that survived. Because at 16, she was the oldest. The other children in my father's family were, like the oldest one was like 12, and then the rest were like 5 or 6. And in my mother's family, there was one child that my mother had a niece. And of course, they were all children. These were my first cousins, and they were all killed. Of course, I didn't know about that right away. My parents, all of their friends were Holocaust survivors, and I did not meet an adult for whom English was a first language until I started school. So I would hear my parents speak in their collection of languages, Yiddish, German. With my father's case, my father was from Poland, and when they played cards, the men would play in one place and the women would play elsewhere. This is the Catskills. This was my magic escape from New York City, was our summers in the Catskills. And so I was near where my father was. I was probably a year older than I am in this picture. And I heard them all talking, and I heard every once in a while I'd hear an English word. So I heard the word camp. I knew about camp. You have arts and crafts and swimming, I knew about camp. And then every once in a while I would hear the word concentration. And my older brother, as you see in this picture, who's a lot older than I am, taught me the card game, concentration. So at 5, I said, this must be kind of a boring camp if all they do is play this card game. So I said, "Daddy, what's a concentration camp?" I was 5 years old. My father was a lot like Tevye, really quick on his feet to think of an answer. And this is what he said to me. Concentration camp was a place where they made big pots of soup out of potatoes and water. And all the people who were fat and healthy, they got to eat the potatoes. And all the people who were skinny and didn't have enough to eat, they only got to have the water. And we were all in such a place. So at age 5, I understood. I didn't know about what else happened, but I did know it was a place where they didn't do the right things to people. So then at age 8, I found this photograph of this beautiful little girl who kind of looked to me like Shirley Temple. And I was a smart kid, and I knew I had relatives in Israel and Hungary. And I knew it was an old picture. So of course I said, "Oh, is this one of our relatives in Israel or Hungary who grew up?" And my mother said, "No, she died in concentration camp." And then about a year later, I found this other picture. And I was very excited because I actually recognized this boy as being who I called my American cousin. His father was my grandmother's youngest brother, my paternal grandmother's youngest brother. And he was born in Poland, but he got the family out to New York. And so, but when they were either visiting back there or before they got out, there was a picture of him. And I said, "But who's that other little boy?" I didn't know him at all. And then I was told that was my Aunt Basha's son. If you remember, Aunt Basha was this lady here, and this was her daughter. I didn't know she had a son. And because he was like 12, he died. And so these pictures like haunted me for years. And I wrote a song, which I figure I'll do now because the first line of the song is "What's in a Photograph?" So I'm going to do this song and then I will continue. Right now I'm talking more about my experience as a child of survivors, and then I'm going to go back into my mother's story. I actually went on Zoom last night with a high school friend so he could teach me to adjust my settings so that you could hear the guitar. So hopefully that will work. What's in a photograph? Two little boys with smiling faces, shining bright with childhood's graces, cousins, each from different places. One lived in America, land of plenty, land of freedom. The other lived not far from Warsaw. No child should have seen what he saw. One returned to New York City, made his fortune, raised a family. The other met his death untimely. If he had grown up, what could he be? Eulogy, eulogy. None came forth to rescue me. I stood alone as I stand now. How little's changed with time somehow. The world still sees the enemy when it looks upon the child that is me. What's in a photograph? A little girl with blonde curls skating, unaware of what was waiting, far too young to know of hating. If she had been allowed to live, what were the many gifts that she could give? Perhaps a cure for cancer. We will never know the answer. I wasn't born when they were herded into wagons and deserted, led like cattle to a slaughter by men who just followed orders. Eulogy, eulogy. None came forth to rescue me. I stood alone as I stand now. How little's changed with time somehow. The world still sees the enemy when it looks upon the child that is me. What's worse perhaps than yesterday is hatred walks with pride today. Indifference always clears the way, and fear gives hate a place to stay. As long as some remain unfree, a chain binds all humanity, unbroken by complacency, till it's too late for you and me. Eulogy, eulogy. None came forth to rescue me. I stood alone as I stand now. How little's changed with time somehow. The world still sees the enemy when it looks upon the child that is me. Keeping the guitar close by, but I'm going to probably do one song near the end. But writing that song was very cathartic for me. It just helped me process these feelings. So my mom came from a Hungarian family in Transylvania, Nagyvarad, but that piece of land kept going back and forth between Romania and Hungary, depending on who won which war and who was punishing whom. And so my mother's siblings, I had it written here so that people can read it, but basically her sibling, my mother was born in 26, and the Great Depression took a toll on the family's finances, and her siblings then, her sisters were 17 and 12, and her brother was 14 and she was 3, and they blamed her, they teased her that it was her fault. But they were all born, her older siblings were all born in Hungary. She was born in Romania, same place, but it was Romania. And she was a victim of anti-Semitism basically her whole life. And I believe in sort of a strange way that one of the reasons why she survived as psychologically relatively unscathed was because her whole life had been like this. This was just a more brutal version of what her life had been. So starting school in Romania, and the girls that sat behind her used to stick their fountain pens in her neck and tell her to go to Palestine. And, she was 7 years old. She didn't even know what Palestine was. And one day she was just tired of this abuse. So she picked up her books, second gradish, first gradish, and went home. And so she told her parents what happened. And when I was young, I didn't understand this. She said her mother sent somebody to the school. And I'm thinking, why didn't her mother go herself? And then I realized it's because she didn't speak Romanian. There was a lot of animosity between the Hungarians and the Romanians. And if you spoke one word of Hungarian in the school, you had to pay a penalty. So my grandmother sent somebody who worked in her store to talk to the teacher about why she left. And the teacher said, she should have come to me. Now she has to stay home for 2 days. So she got punished for what these kids did to her. And the only other Jewish child in the class was there because she was the daughter of a World War I veteran. And she wasn't a particularly good student. And what the principal, and I remember these are adults, the principal would walk in and he would ask a question to this other girl, and she didn't answer correctly. So my mother had to stand up. He said, Eva, stand up. When a Jew is stupid, a Jew is really stupid, huh? And this is how my mother's childhood was. She was constantly berated and physically hurt for having been Jewish. And then, of course, having been Hungarian in a Romanian world. But then the Second Vienna Accord, which was when Nazi Germany met with Italy, and they decided to award Transylvania back to Hungary. And so my mother talked about how thrilled all of the Hungarians were, but they didn't realize what was coming by this happening. Because in 1944, at this point, of course, the Nazis were already losing the war in 1944, but they felt it was more important to put their resources into getting the Jews out of Hungary and deporting them to Auschwitz than to support the troops. So it was very quickly when the Nazis ended. My mother described them as being like young kids because most of the ones that were normal age were fighting on the front. But they came in and it was 6 weeks afterwards, they created the ghetto. What they did is they went to a religious part of the town and they took, again, nobody knew this, it was found out afterwards. They took all these people out of their houses and they put them in the synagogue and then loaded them onto cars and deported them all to Auschwitz. So now all these little houses were free. So they brought all the rest of the Jewish families into the ghetto. And my mother described the fact you'd have one room in a house and there was a family in each corner of the room. No matter how many people there was a family in each corner. And, people might try to put up a sheet or something, but, there was no privacy. It was a communal kitchen, but not much food to cook. And the Nazis and the Hungarian Nazis that were in charge would come, every few days to try to confiscate any valuables that people might have taken with them. So one day they came and they asked my grandmother for a suitcase so they could do this. So she had to give them the suitcase. And they said, send your daughter the next day to the police station to pick up the suitcase. So my mother went at 16 years old to the police station. She gets in there and the Hungarian policeman locks the door and he starts to essentially try to rape her. And he was foiled in mid-attempt because there was a knock on the door, a very loud knock. So there was another officer, so he had to let him in. And my mother, ran out of there without the suitcase. And so that was her first experience with, because what the guy said to her before, when she was fighting with him, he said, where you're going, this doesn't matter. Nothing really matters where you're going. where were they going? That's not like they knew, my mother, and actually that part of my mother's story is actually in the play Survivors, when they do the different vignettes. That particular scene is in there, right, when she says, well, where were we going? And so, of course, they found out in June where they were going. These are stock photos of the trains, being loaded. I put them in this PowerPoint when I'd bring my mother for students, to see, the stock footage of what it looked like. And, my mother, of course, describes being stuffed into the rail cars, and there was no food, no water, just a bucket in the center to use as a toilet. And, after a few days, they arrived in Auschwitz, and my mother talked about the screaming, house, 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 and the dogs were barking. And, people, of course, are disoriented, and they lined up always, she said, always rows of five. They separated the men and the women, and it was rows of five. And then, of course, they came before Mengele or one of his, emissaries. And my mother said it was Mengele. A lot of the survivors that I know say it was Mengele. I don't know if Mengele was really there selecting every single person, or if, there were other people there. But so my mother was in a row with her sister Agnes, who was the sister closest to her in age. She was 9 years older, and she was my mother's favorite sibling, because she, no matter what, she was always kind of kinder, treated my mother better. Her oldest sister, the one who was the mother of this child, was was a very different kind of person, was very into looks and clothes and shopping and stuff like that. And this one was more intellectual. And my mother's brother, this is obviously a much later picture. I didn't have one from him from that time. But the interesting thing was that my cousin Olga, who is in Hungary, may have tuned on to the Zoom and may be seeing this, but because I asked her for the picture, he had polio. And no one really understands how he survived, and he was very sensitive about it. So his siblings never asked, his wife never asked, his daughter never asked, how did you survive Auschwitz? Because usually when they did selection, anybody with a scar or anything that looked wrong with them, they would get selected to go to the gas chambers. So the only thing that I can think of is that my mother told me when they did the separation, at this point, they weren't tattooing people anymore, because Auschwitz was just a holding pen, because they couldn't kill everybody at once. So they would kill the less healthy ones, and the ones that looked like they could do some work, they would stay alive. And when they did this, they gave them clothes, but they let them keep their shoes. So I'm wondering if perhaps my uncle, having had, shoes that were corrective, and he had a strong upper body, because otherwise I can't think of how he survived, but he did. And so my mother was in the row with this sister, and with her niece, and her mother, and this sister was someplace else, and another woman, a stranger. And when they came before Mengele, they sent my grandmother and my cousin to the left, and they loaded them onto trucks, and they sent my mother, my aunt, and the other woman to the right. And here my grandmother was with her granddaughter, but she looked, her daughter was 17, was, her baby. And she called out, Eva, what's going to happen to you? And that was something that was always so painful for my mother, that, nobody knew what was happening to anyone. But the last conversation she had with her mother, or she didn't get to speak to her, she said, what's going to happen to you? And pretty soon they found out, after they took them into the room and shaved their heads, and sent them to the barracks, gave them whatever they had to wear, and sent them to the barracks. This is an experience that several Auschwitz survivors have told me, that this is how they found out about what happened to their parents. Somebody who had been in the barracks longer than they had took them to the little tiny window, and they said, see that window? See that smoke out there? That's your mother and your father going up in smoke there. And that's how they all learned about the fate of the people that were separated from them. And the fact that several survivors had the same experience, that this was, a universal thing, is what they found out. And so then they did my mom always talked about the roll call in the morning. They wake you up at 4:30 in the morning. You can see these are the, stock footage of the toilets, and they were sort of sinks with a little bit of cold water. And everyone had a very short period of time to go to the bathroom and wash with cold water, whatever they could. And then they'd stand up there for hours being counted. And my mother said, well, where are we going to go? The fences, the fences were electrified. It's true, some people dug underground. There were people who escaped. But I think it was more for the brutality that they wanted to make these people suffer even more. And then they got their piece of bread, which was usually made, they didn't have enough flour, so they put sawdust in the bread so that everybody got a hunk of bread, and depending on what piece you ended up with, you might have an entire thing of sawdust, or you might be one of the lucky ones that got more bread than sawdust, of course. And then, the lunch was what my father explained, the soup. And my aunt came up with, was assigned as to fix the boots of the Nazi soldiers. So she took my mother with her. We didn't know where the other sister was, in a different barracks, but this one sister always took care of my mom. And so they would take them once a month for disinfection. And they would pass by a Roma camp, which people called gypsies then, the Roma people. And these women would walk by this camp, and they couldn't help but feel jealous. They said, look at these people. They're living out here. There's parents and grandparents and children are playing, and they're cooking over. Why are these people there with their whole families, and by us, so many people were killed? Well, one day rather, in the fall, when they went by, the camp was completely empty. And they didn't know what happened. They found out the next day that night they basically took all the Roma people and sent them all to the gas chamber. So much for the jealousy. Another experience my mom had, going across, because you had to walk across the whole camp. And apparently, when my mother's row of 5, there was a woman who had spotted amongst the men working, must have been a relative, maybe a boyfriend or brother or somebody, and called out the name. And the SS man next to my mother, she described him as being really tiny, but she said his hands were like 2 hands. And he slapped her because she was the closest one. And the whole row of 5 women fell over, and my mom had a swollen face, for a week. So those were the kinds of experiences that she had. Then in September of that year, the Allies were advancing, and they needed picked a group of 1,000 women to dig foxholes on the German and Polish border. So my mom and both her sisters, that's the first time they saw the other sister, were among the 1,000 women who were selected to dig these foxholes. And one of the things that my mother, I think, was amazing about both my parents is they always spoke about if there was a Nazi who did a nice thing, they would always make sure that I knew that too. And so the men who were, teaching them how to dig the foxholes, my mother said this group was called the SR. They were mostly older men who were not fighting age, but they had some kind of trade or profession. And based on whatever that trade or profession was, they sent them to work. So this one group of people was supervising the women digging. And at one time at lunch, this one man had a beautiful tomato, and he gave the tomato to my mother. And my mother, it was like a prize. It was like worth more than $1 million. And she said that in Auschwitz, they had a spoon and a bowl, which they took with them to this new job. They actually flattened one end of the spoon to make it like a knife in case they ever got anything that they had to cut. And so my mother used her spoon knife, and she cut it into 5 pieces and shared it with the 4 other women who were working next to her. But she always, that was like a prize, was this tomato. So then it got to be cold, you can't dig in the ground when it starts to get frozen in November. And at this point, the Allies were advancing, and this is when the death marches began. So they took these, 1,000 women, and they went, this shows you kind of the route from where they were. Schlesiersee was where they were digging, and they went along and walked along this route. And my mother, at this point, her shoes had fallen apart, and her sister took part of the gray blankets that they each had and wrapped it around her feet so she had something on her feet. But of course, as soon as you step out into the snow, it gets wet and your feet freeze. So she really had a hard time walking. At one point, they would all stop at barns, and one night they stopped at a particularly large barn. And I don't know if the farmer felt sorry for the people, but he tossed under the closed door some like turnips. And so all the women were grabbing, to grab a turnip. And my mom was trying to grab one too, but she didn't make it. All she got was scratches from other women, and they got really infected. And so she was getting sicker. Meanwhile, that next morning, when it was time to walk, they noticed there were 12 women missing. And my mother's oldest sister, Clara, the one who hadn't been with them as much as Agnes, she was among these 12 women who were missing. So some of the Nazis lined up the women outside, and they went back into the barn with pitchforks into the hay, figuring that they couldn't have gotten far, they're probably hiding. And so they got 11 of the 12 women, and the women outside could hear the screams, and of course they shot them. And my mother and her other sister didn't know, if who was the one who survived. Could it have been their sister? Could have been anybody. But then they went on and they went to, they stopped at Helmbrechts, which was a small camp. It was a sub-camp of Auschwitz. And my mother, who was having too much trouble walking, they put her into the infirmary. And my mother describes there was only 2-layer bunk beds, but she would wake up each morning with a dead foot or a dead hand on her body. And she could tell, she felt a little stronger from resting, but she could tell that this was not that once the group left that she would be killed. So when they were called out to attention to start marching, my mother crawled out of the infirmary and crawled after the group. And the SS woman took her number down. Their numbers were on their clothes. Took her number down and said, at twilight, you're going to be shot. So, I can't even imagine, you're 17, 18 years old, and your life is going to end when the sun goes down, and you can have a hard time walking anyway. And as she described it, twilight came, and she was lined up with these 12 women. She was the last one. And they fired the machine gun, and my mom just dropped on the bodies. I don't know if she did it on purpose. I don't think she knows if she just passed out or if she just knew to drop, but she dropped. So she was on top, and they stepped on her and said, "Oh, they're all dead." And my mother held her breath when she's lying on this pile of bodies. And I put this picture of the wooded area because that's along the route. She described it as having a lot of pine trees. And that night, a Jeep stopped, and she heard German words, so she just held her breath, and they stepped on her again, and they said, tot, they're all dead, and they left. So my mother realized that she needed to not be in this pile anymore, so she crawled and ended up falling into a hole by a tree. And she probably slept there for, she doesn't know how long, but she slept there. And the irony, of course, is when she woke up, the rest of the group had gone, and her sister that she loved so much, they took the last 50 women who had left and shot them anyway. There was no plan at this point because they were just trying to get rid of the evidence of the atrocities. They did not expect to lose the war. So, and that's kind of a famous picture of bringing the townspeople by to see what their government had done. So somewhere in that pile is my aunt, my mother's beloved sister. And so my mom ended up, walking into this town. At this point, she didn't know this, the Allies were already in, and she would ask for food, and people would give her food, but when you haven't eaten in a long time, it's really not good to eat heavy food. And so she got really sick from food that people had given her, and nobody would let her sleep like in a barn. And then she describes this as this just shows you people being marched on the death marches when people say nobody knew. You could see somebody, took this picture, just a regular citizen. So this was kind of the towns that they were. They were in Bavaria. And so my mom said she saw this like beautiful, like a big farm building and a wool factory, whatever. And she said, standing on the stoop, she says, a beautiful German woman with her hair piled up to her head. And my mother asked her for food. And she said, is there any place I can sleep? And the woman said, sure. And actually let her into the house and took her up to a room and where there was a lot of wool, so she let her sleep there. And this woman was actually a doctor. Her husband was a sheep farmer, and this picture, I found this picture from a sheep herding magazine in the 1960s. That he had developed some special breed of sheep that do well in that part of Bavaria. And I look at that picture and it kind of reminds me, I've sung at a lot of churches too, and it reminds me sometimes of the way they pictured, Christ with sheep. He looks very benign in this picture. And so this doctor knew that for my mother to get better, she had to put her on clear liquids, and she took care of her. She put her on clear liquids. She gradually increased her diet to include farina, and took care of her, washed, the wound. She had a lot of open wounds and sores from the lice and everything else that was. And so one day, this woman came into the room that she'd given my mother and said, can you tell me what happened? What did the Nazis do to you? Spoke in German. My mother knew German. And she told them. And this woman started crying. And my mother didn't know, was she crying because she was sad about the story, but she was crying because her husband was in the SS, and the Allies had come in and taken away all these men. And he was in the SS apparently because if with a lot of people, if you didn't become an SS officer, they took your stuff away. And this had been a family sheep farm. So he was in the SS, but they were not able to find him to have been guilty of any crimes. And my mother actually wrote a letter saying that this woman saved her life. And after my mother was no longer there, they did let her husband go. But one day, this woman brings a visitor up to my mother, and he's dressed in a suit and he's got a briefcase. And he speaks to my mother in German, Bist du ein Jude? And my mother's like, no, I'm not a Jew, I'm a Hungarian refugee, because she thought he came to take her back. She didn't know, And then he said, no, I'm also, a survivor, whatever, a refugee, whatever they called themselves. I just went through the same thing as you did. And so this guy, it's hard to see here, he's in this picture. That was my mother's visitor. And here he is pictured with his forced labor crew building the Autobahn. And of course, that was my father. So he had come from Poland, and he had actually signed up voluntarily to go to labor camp because he was already married. His wife was a silversmith, so the Nazis used her, to melt down silver and gold, but he kind of was feeling like a parasite. Although there's one call it a funny story. My father came from a Hasidic family in Poland. And when the Nazis invaded, my grandfather was extremely worried that my father would get drafted into the Polish army and he wouldn't be able to eat kosher food. And this was his big worry. So they went to the Radomski rabbi, who was the rabbi that they followed. And the rabbi said, I think we have a lot bigger problems coming than your son won't be able to eat kosher food in the army. And so basically my father signed up to go to a labor camp where they said you go home on weekends. But of course, you didn't go home. You were just part of forced labor. And so he spent most of his time in forced labor groups, although when he escaped from his death march in the same area that my mother was, he had been in Buchenwald. And he had escaped. And the reason that he had a suit was because he stopped at the same farm and he didn't want to wear the, the torn up constant. He said, "Do you have any clothes you can give me?" And so she took him upstairs to her husband's closet and said, "Pick out whatever you want." So he picked out a suit and a briefcase. So that's why my mother thought he was, a Nazi and had come to take her back. And she met him again in the Army Field Hospital. And, they were kind of, my mother was alone and he had a friend with him. And when they recovered, my mother also describes, going into the field hospital and people thinking she was 80 instead of 18 because of what people look like, when you've got wounds all over you. And she described being they didn't have a lot of, medication. So she was washed every day with alcohol by the nurses. So it was very painful, but eventually she got better. And he said that he and some of his friends were going to get in a coal wagon to go to Bergen-Belsen because there was a listing of who had survived and you might be able to find out who of your family survived. So my mother went with these 8 guys and they were on a coal truck, went very slowly. And because it went so slowly, it was fall, they pick, oh, there's a ripe pear, and they would pick pears. And when they got there, my father found out that this is my father's family. This was my uncle, the father of this little boy who was the same little boy in that picture. My grandmother, this was my grandmother, and this was her youngest brother. And so my uncle Isaac, he found out that he died of appendicitis, that the Nazis really liked him because he was very handy. He could fix things, and he had an appendicitis attack and they tried to operate on him, but he died under the knife. So he found out that happened to him. His favorite sister, Mancha, had a 5-year-old son, and they tried to separate her from her son in selection. And she says, "Wherever my son goes, I go." These are the stories that he heard from people there. And so, of course, she went to the gas chamber. And one sister, the one who was closest to him in age, had the foresight to go to Palestine. And so she was the closest one to him in age. She was 3 years older. And so she didn't experience this and had a son in Israel. And this one again here is my Aunt Basha, who had the 2 kids. And so he found out his wife was also killed. So having found out all of this stuff, my mom was sent to a barracks where there were Hungarian women. And she gets there and she says they're all putting on makeup and lipstick and they were all going to go have dates with the English soldiers. So they said she had just walked in and she said she was very naive, and they said, "You come with us too." So, they put some lipstick on her and she went, and she was very lucky. The soldier she was with saw how naive she was. He took her back to the barracks and he said, "Don't you ever go out with an English soldier again." And it was, so there's these little stories that I heard growing up that some are lighter, that were nice to hear. Well, when my mother found out everyone in my father's family had been killed, she was afraid to find out anything about her own family. She figured, well, probably everybody was dead too. And my father ran into a cousin in Bergen-Belsen, and he was described her as being a little bit flighty, a little bit out there. And so he ran into her and she said, "I'm going to be an actress. I'm going to go." And he said, "Okay, but in case you decide that you are not going to be an actress and you want to be with family," he gave her the address of the place where he and his friend Morris and my mother were staying in Bavaria. 2 weeks later, she showed up, and there was a double wedding. My mother and father, and this is my father's cousin Frida, and Morris, who was the friend who he pulled out of the death march with him. And, they were each other's witnesses. It's not like you had anything. They were not in a DP camp per se. They were just in this part of Bavaria, and they were given places to live. And my mother describes that one of the wedding presents was a toothbrush, and how precious it was to get a toothbrush. So they lived in Bavaria, and here they are digging their garden. It was, I'm trying the name of it, Feuchtwangen. because that's when my brother was born, in Feuchtwangen. And so they had a garden, they started to have a life. Here's that same picture. My brother was born. When my mother was pregnant with my brother, she got a letter from the Red Cross and found out the one woman from the barn who survived was her sister Clara. And so she went and lived in Haifa and raised her son in Haifa. I didn't actually meet any of my other first cousins, other than the one that was so much older than me, till I was an adult. My cousin, well, no, I did go to Hungary with my mother when I was 11, and I got to meet her at 14, but I didn't get to meet Amos until I was in my 50s. But so that you start to rebuild a family. And let me get to this next slide here. There. So I love this picture of my brother, his little suit, and he's with a next door neighbor who to me is such a quintessential, Hitler Youth looking kid, and his name was Herman, and he would run and say, Herman, so he was cute that he would play with him. And after a few years, they still felt a sense of malaise in Germany. And my father's uncle, the one in that picture who had been the father of the little boy, offered to sponsor them in America. So in 1949, they came to America. And when it was 60 years in America, I had this picture cake done of my mother and my brother. And my mom was like really had the hair, the hair of that style. She always looked really good. And people would always ask her when we go someplace as a family, they'd assume that my brother was my father's son from her first marriage. And she said, no, that was my son. She gave birth to him at 20 and gave birth to me at 29. So, and this is my neighborhood in the Bronx, and of course, I'm the one in the dorky hat. And then when my mom, this was actually her 80th birthday, we all got together at my brother's house and in Florida. And so, my brother, his kids were much older, and this was my kid, and was my other kid who was not around at the time. These are her children, and this one is his child. So but as I watched my parents and all of their friends become grandparents, and these were people who all lost their own parents, and, now they were suddenly the grandparents. And it made me wonder, what's it like to have a grandparent? And so I wrote this song. I presented it. There is a rather well-known, he was kind of, not exactly a Kindertransport child, because he was sponsored by a synagogue, came from Germany to Rochester. His name was Werner Halpern. He was a very beloved, he was a psychiatrist. He started the Hillside Children's Center, and he used to write poetry. And we used to present together as a child of survivors and a child of non-survivors. And I wrote this song kind of including that and and seeing my parents and other friends become grandparents. Grandma, look at me, I'm climbing up the apple tree. What's it like to have a grandma? Grandpa, will you come with me? There's something I want you to see. What's it like to have a grandpa? Other people's grandparents sometimes die before they're born, and since they never knew them, perhaps they never mourn. But the world stood by while mine were murdered in mass graves, and I don't understand why no one saved them. Grandma, look at me, I'm climbing up the apple tree. What's it like to have a grandma? Grandpa, will you come with me? There's something I want you to see. What's it like to have a grandpa? Another child born in the first half of the century. He lost his mom and dad, and he's a lot like me. There's 30 years and half a world between our two birthdays, but the same crime took both our childhoods away. Grandma, Grandma, look at me, I'm climbing up the apple tree. What's it like to have a grandma? Grandpa, will you come with me? There's something I want you to see. What's it like to have a grandpa? Grandparents and parents are gifts we can't always keep, but they carve a path for us in waters swift and deep. So if you have them, let them take you along their river ride. Let them fill your sails with wisdom, love, and pride. Grandma, Grandma, look at me. Grandpa, Grandpa, can you see? Though you're gone, our family lives on. And there again, another picture of my mom, myself, my late husband, my kid, my nephew and his daughter. And here at Jiva, with the Survivor Archive behind her. And here, you know, the link for survivors. And there's my mother in the center there. So these were the first actors that portrayed the survivors in the Rochester production. And so with that, I think this is a good place to end and see if there are any questions.
Well, thank you, Bonnie, so much. It has been amazing, an amazing story, and I think everybody was moved by it. I'm gonna send a link for the survivors play in a moment in the chat.
Not the survivors play, it's a completely different play. That was also stories of survivors by a different theater group.
Yeah, these are all survivors of Rochester. I don't know, my thing just went away here. I don't know what happened. No, it doesn't make, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, and you just
Yeah,
have to turn on
my
your
picture went away.
video.
But start my video. Sorry about that.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes,
I guess
that's
I
what
can
happened.
stop the share too, but I just there. The survivors play depicts the stories of 10 Rochester area survivors, and it's all their actual words. And I was director of CHI at the time when it was being developed, and so I had the honor of working a little bit with Wendy, and she chose the survivors to show a different array of experiences, from the German experience of being excluded from society to, you know, the Eastern European experiences of the ghettos and the camps. And it's a really beautifully done play, and it's short. So, you know, it's like an hour long altogether.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Bonnie. This was wonderful. And I want to take advantage of the fact that this is a Zoom and not a webinar, and we can have other people weigh in. Yom Shoah comes a week after Pesach, where we become a people, and where we are told that we need to remember how we were slaves. But what does it really mean? What is our responsibility? And we say never again. Again, what does that mean? And this past year and a half have been very difficult in that respect. And we're all seeing the rise of anti-Semitism here in the US. What does it mean?
Are you asking me that as a question or other people?
like to open it to other, I
We're
mean,
opening it. Anybody who wants to join in?
yes.
Are
If
you
there's
gonna
anyone else to respond to that, just raise your hand and we will let you speak. And Bonnie, if you want to answer that, that would be great.
No, I'm happy. I don't want to like lock other people out, but what I would say, and I've always felt this way, that as a descendant of people who went through what my family went through, I feel that it's my responsibility to speak out when this happens to anybody else. And I know that we're in a very strange world, but I've always, when I would educate, I always try to bring in other people who are marginalized. And actually, I don't mean to, but this is one story I had wanted to tell. I took my mother, Rosemary Mulzer, who was also in the play, and another survivor to speak at an inner city middle school. And after the survivors spoke, the teacher turned to the survivors and said, all of you have had members of your family either beaten or jailed or killed. Then she turned to the students and she said, how many of you have had members of your family beaten, jailed, or killed? Almost the entire class. The hands went up. She turned back to the survivors and she said, what can you tell these kids? How did you get over these things happening to you and your family and become these productive citizens? And without fail, all three of them said the most important thing is not to hate. And Rosemary Mulzer said, hatred is like drinking poison and hoping the people you hate die. And I think that that's just an important lesson, that we can't ever act like the perpetrators. You know, we have to be the upstanders. It's our responsibility. So that's what I do now too.
That's lovely.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks, Bonnie. My video's off.
Someone else joined?
No, this
Linda?
is. But I just wanted to say I met my Bonnie's mother and heard her. My video's off. I don't know, but yeah, she's fascinating woman and story. What's her name again?
Olga, can I turn on the video for you? I think it's your cousin. Bonnie, I think it's your cousin Olga.
Oh, well, no, because I thought it was Rosa who was speaking, but
Yeah, it was
my cousin
Rosa.
Olga did.
Rosa.
I don't
Sorry.
know where Olga is in this, if she can be found. I can't see her on my screen, but
Olga is, she's here. Olga, can we turn your mic on and your camera?
Hmm.
I'm not succeeding doing it.
Okay.
I see
Well,
that
good
we have some very interesting comments in the chat, Bonnie.
yeah,
You
if
might
you
be
get the
interested in
chat.
reading some. People with similar shared similar experiences of your parents, same experiences that your parents had shared with you. Additional stories and information. There is another couple of resources that I'm going to drop right now into the chat. There's a book about Hungarian Jews Holocaust, which is highly recommended. Lee, I think you had another suggestion.
Yes, I will put a link to a little video that was done by the Brave Theater in LA. It tells the story of another survivor, or the daughter of a survivor. It's very short, it's about 3 minutes, but it has a call for action in this day and age, or in any age. So I find it to be very powerful, and I will just disclose that the actress in that clip is my daughter. So
I'll share that link right now.
yeah. I think Rose raised her hand.
What?
Rose, not Rosa. Yeah, here's Rose.
Thank you. Enjoy is not the right thing. I appreciate all that Bonnie has shared with us today. For me, and I have from my family, of course, many stories. I, until this past year and a half, would say, why did people go? Why did people go? How did they go? Why didn't they not go? Whatever. And then all of a sudden now I'm starting to understand how this happened. And the lest we never forget troubles me because of the directions some things are going in. And I have family in Israel. 2 years ago, I was there for 6 weeks. This was before October. 3 times on this little children. And the little children want me. So what's hard for me is not go in that direction again. That's the part that I don't feel that I have control over and the way I usually. So thank you for sharing. And it's for me yet another enlightenment, and that I find scary. So thank you.
Thank you.
Toda rabba.
Thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you, Bonnie, for this amazing story that you have shared. Linda, you wanted to add one more thing?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you, when Bonnie, you were talking, did you mention somebody called Rosemary Moser?
Rosemary Mulzer. She,
Now, is she from South Africa?
yes, she was not from South Africa, but she lived in what was the Belgian Congo. So she was in Africa, but part of her story was because she was too old to go on a kinder transport. She went as a maid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. I think it must be another Rosemary Moser because my daughter has a best friend in Cape Town, Rosemary Moser, and I just
Hmm.
thought, well,
Well,
wow, could
maybe
it be?
Moser. That could be different. This is Molzer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank
And
you.
that's her married name too. So
Okay, no, different person. I just thought that would be too amazing.
very similar sounding though.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you again, everybody. This week we'll be marking Yom HaShoah. Next week, part of the Jewish national holiday is going to be Yom HaZikaron, Israel's Memorial Day for the fallen, the high price that the state of Israel required and still requires in order to maintain its freedom, its independence, followed by Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel's Independence Day. Today in Israel, we mark 500 and 600
560.
564 days since October 7th. We still have 59 hostages in Gaza. 24 are assumed to be still alive. And I'm asking everyone here to do your part by raising awareness. Reach out to your synagogues, to your rabbis, to your Jewish leaders, write letters, ask our leaders to intervene and get our people out of there. Thank you all. And we will send a recording of this event tonight in a follow-up email. Thank you, Lee.
Thank you. And thank you, Bonnie, once again.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all.